Welcome back to Sailing El Jaleo! Everything had been going way too smoothly in the new system we were putting in to tie the alternator safely into the lithium iron phosphate battery bank. And we couldn't do it that way. I mean, come on, it wouldn't be El Jaleo fashion if everything went smoothly. Cue the alternator. This week I'm going to struggle with the alternator, and I go through several of them and finally, hopefully, cobble one together out of parts from several different ones. And I honestly don't know how this is going to turn out yet, because as I'm doing this intro, it's not complete yet, but it will be complete by the end of the video, so we will know together if it works or not. I guess we might as well go ahead and get right into it. Grab a drink, climb aboard, and let's get going. In YouTube time, hopefully this video is coming out 1 week after the first part of the alternator installation project came out. If it does, and I don't know yet because I'm not finished with the project, if this does come out back to back, then hey, something must have gone right. But in real time, it was about 6 weeks between filming the first section and then now filming the final alternator install. So hopefully this comes out 1 week after the first part did. If not, if you know there might be some washer install stuff in between, then something went very wrong again, which is not outside the realm of possibility. And this is the first time I'm watching this footage, and oh geez, that is a really unflattering shot. What can I say? I love beer and food. I think I might have to give up food. Damn, I'm getting fat. Anyway, back to the alternator. The alternator that originally came with El Jaleo was a 165 amp Lease Neville alternator, and they were used in the early 90s on large pickups like F350s, that kind of stuff. I think back then they might have been E350s, but whatever. They were the bigger, heavier duty versions, ambulances, that kind of stuff, where they needed the higher power load. So they were not common, and it's impossible to find a new one because, I mean, it's from the early 90s, so they're 30 years old at this point. And I couldn't find any used ones, but I did find it's supposedly the exact same unit, but it was new. It was a Chinese knockoff, and it was the only thing I could find. It was supposed to be the exact same dimensions, and it came in several different configurations. There's a 2-inch foot, I'm sorry, a 1-inch foot or a 3-inch foot. I had the 3-inch foot, so I ordered that. And they had them upgraded, so you could either get externally regulated, which is what the alternator originally was. There's an external regulator for it. And they had internally regulated ones. So I thought it would be nice to get rid of the external regulator. So I went with the internal regulated one, internally regulated, and it was supposed to have an output for the tach. So the engine tachometer runs off of the voltage from the alternator. As the voltage varies, as the engine speeds up and slows down, that tells the tach the RPMs that the engine is going. So I needed that because the tach runs off of the alternator. When we left off last week, or 2 weeks ago, whatever the case may be, I was hooking up the battery right at the end of the video, and then I showed an overlay of the DC to DC converters that interface as they powered up. You can see in the lower left-hand corner the lead-acid battery is in that hanging locker, and it is wired in. So the only thing I had left to do was to wire the connections to the alternator, and the lines from the alternator, the positive and negative, went straight over to those new bus bars that I installed. That was all I had to do. And I wanted to get the wiring done before I tried to mount it, because it is a very tight space in there. And unfortunately, these wires are a little bit of overkill. I could have gotten away with 2-gauge wire, but Worst Marine was out of 2-gauge, and normally I would never buy anything from them. But I was in a pinch. Best Boat Wire didn't have it either, and I couldn't wait like a week to get it from, I guess it probably would have been 3 days from Defender, but I wanted to get the project done, At this point in time, the boat was still in the water, and the marina was having some issues with their travel lift. They were getting new tires and stuff put on it. So I had some extra time in the water, and I wanted to get the new alternator in so I could test it while it was still in the water. But unfortunately, that did not happen. After getting the positive and negative wires in place for the alternator, I went ahead and mounted it. And it fit into the engine mount perfectly. It did have the 3-inch foot, so I knew it would fit in there. But other stuff was starting not to line up very well. I don't know what they call it, but there's an adjustment arm that attaches to the alternator, and that allows you to put tension on the alternator belt. And that did not line up with the mount on the engine. It was off by about a 1/2 inch, and that is not that big of a deal. I could have gotten a plug or a spacer to put in between those two to make it work. The bigger problem, and I didn't realize it when I was wiring the alternator, there is no output for the tachometer, which is kind of a big deal. The entire time after the original alternator burned up, I didn't have a tach the entire trip to Florida and then the entire trip back. And when you don't know at what speed you're revving the engine, it's not the best thing in the world. Now, I had kind of a throttle position reference that I used, and I could kind of tell by sound, but you know, the further you get away from that reference sound, you don't really know what's going on there. So it's not an ideal situation. I couldn't do that long term. Now, there are some devices that can read the engine speed that don't use a tach, but I didn't want to get into any of that garbage. So I just wanted something that worked. And actually the most important thing was the pulleys on the alternator did not line up with the pulleys on the engine drive shaft. So that was another problem. I probably could have got some spacers to put in on the engine pulleys, but with all of the issues that the alternator had, you know, the spacing problems and no output for the tach, I just decided to kind of pull the plug on this alternator. It just wasn't going to work for how I wanted it to work. And finally, as with most projects that go sideways, I had the stare of dejection and disbelief. And this time it went on a little longer than it normally does. At that point I was kind of tapped out, and something that should have been an easy switch just was fighting me every step of the way. So I took a little break from this project after that. Hey y'all, after the first alternator failed, I decided just to try and find the original and replace it with an old used one. Now they do come in a couple of different configurations. Here you'll notice this is the original one. This foot is 3 inches, and here the foot is only 1 inch. Even though there's the same alternator, they did come in 2 different sizes. And on all of the ones I've seen, the wire connections, which are right here, have always been right on the top, right where on these 2 ears. But on the one I had, it was rotated 120 degrees, so it was facing upward here. And that oriented it so it was upward when it was in place. So I don't know if Frank took the stator off and rotated it 120 degrees and put it back on, or if it just came that way. I'm not sure. But anyway, so here is the core, and you can see, I don't know enough about alternators to know if the core can be damaged or not. And here's the stator, and you can see they're both pretty blackened, which is not too surprising considering what happened to them. And here's the core, and even though this is a used one, you can see it's in a lot better shape than this core. This core is just charred. So I think originally I was not going to try and change the core because I didn't know if the core could get damaged or not. But at this point in time, I think it'd be better just to replace it. And here's the stator for the new one. You can see it's a heck of a, not new, the used one, but you can see it's a heck of a lot cleaner. And this used alternator actually cost more than the brand new one that I originally tried to replace it with. So that's a little bit frustrating, but I'm hoping I can just put this stator in this old housing, and then I can take this core out and put it in this housing as well, and then the housing will be the same, or at least the important part of this housing will be the same, and then I know it'll line up. And there is an offset here, so this is the one I got, and this is flush up against, there's a little built-in fan here for cooling, and the pulleys here are tight up against it. And on this one, there is a tiny space in here, and it looks like there's a shim in there, and that must have allowed the pulleys to line up with the drive mechanism on the engine. So I'm going to try and use this pulley system on this core and this stator in the old housing. And I know nothing about alternators, so there's probably a lot of people screaming at me right now that you can't do that, and I don't know if you can or not, but I guess I'll find out. I'm hoping I measured and they look to be the same size. This new stator and housing matches with the old one, so I'm hoping it'll work, but I guess time will tell when I fire it up. And not too surprisingly, here is where the plans started to fall apart. I did manage to get the pulley and the little fan off of the old core, but I couldn't actually figure out how to get the core out of the housing. There was a bearing pack that seemed to be a part of the housing, which I knew it couldn't have been, but I couldn't see any way to get it out. There were no nuts, there were no screws, there was a little retaining ring on the back side of the core, but I didn't think that would be holding the whole core in. And I wouldn't have known how to get it out anyway, so I had to admit defeat on this one. You know, if push comes to shove, so what I ended up doing was using the old core. Now, from what I understand of an alternator core, it's just a winding of copper wire. Here again, I don't know what I'm talking about. That's just how I understand it. So I didn't see how that could possibly get damaged. Anything's possible. I'm sure it's possible to damage it, but I was hoping that the old core is still functional and intact. So I left the old core in there. I used the new stator in the old housing, and if push comes to shove, I might just have to take the two cores to an auto shop and they'll know how to remove them from the housing. So if it doesn't work, I'll just swap the cores. I'll just have to have someone else do it because I either don't have the tools, I'm not smart enough to figure it out. Whatever the case is, I hope the old core works. If not, I have a replacement for it. And as per usual, I had to put the alternator together a total of 3 times. Actually more if you count the parts that I broke in a few minutes. But so the first time I put the alternator together, I thought, well, let's just put the core and the stator together, because then I have access to the bolts and I can get those in and everything will be fine. But then when I went to put the pulley on, I realized I couldn't stop the core from spinning, which is attached to the pulley. So there was no way for me to tighten down the nut. So I had to take it back apart and change it. And then, that time when I put it back together, this was even before I got the pulley on, thankfully, I realized that the orientation of the stator, I had put it on upside down, so the wiring would have been on the bottom, facing the engine when I mounted it. Thankfully I noticed that. So I could switch it a third time, and I finally got the pulley onto the core, and then I put the core and the stator together in the correct orientation, and that's when I broke something. Well, now we have a new problem. Either when I was being a Luddite, this is longer than this shaft is longer, but it seems to spin okay. So the bearing is seated in there. I think maybe I just broke this back housing. I don't know what this thing does, but I'm sure it's important. So I'm going to try and remove this plastic piece and put this one on. I don't know, I might have just fucked it all up. So I think I figured out what I did wrong. So on this back housing, you can see there are two little things in here. And I was trying to figure out how in the heck are these oriented so it would fit. And I noticed one of these surfaces here is curved. I don't know, there you go, you can see it's a little curved. And that's when it hit me, that is those are hitting these curved surfaces here. And these are on springs because they actually go back up inside the housing. That's the problem. So, when I put the shaft in this one, these two were not stuffed back up in their housing. So I broke the back off of the cap because they were not oriented properly. So I'm going to try and get these guys up in the housing and get it on here. And the screws do line up, so I think I might not be out 350 bucks. Okay, so here I took the top plate off because I realized there'd be no way for me to get those in there and get it mounted. So the top plate comes off, and here is where you drop in the little thingamabobber. So that's going to make life a lot easier. And it was a bit of a struggle, since I've got 10 thumbs, to get everything back in the housing, hold it down, hold the springs down, hold everything down, and slide the top back on. It took me a few tries, but I got it. So I think between everything, I think I finally have maybe one functioning alternator. And if the core's bad, I can always swap it out. And you know, I didn't realize at the time, but I'm not going to say it was a good thing I broke that wiring harness there on the back, but the wiring configuration was slightly different between the newer one and then the original one. So, and I knew how the wires went on the old one because I labeled them, so I think it'll actually work out just marginally better. I won't have to try and figure out what goes where on the new one because I can just line it up with the old one. So yeah, I guess we'll see what happens. When I got the alternator back to the boat, my original plan was to get it mounted and then wired, and then I could tension the belt and all that good stuff. But I mounted it, and I actually found out that I didn't have access to the wiring. It would be too difficult to try and do it while it was mounted. So I dismounted the alternator, did all of the wiring, and then put her back in place. When it comes time to tension the alternator belt, I am about as strong as a field mouse, so I always use a ratchet strap to put tension on the alternator while I tighten down all of the bolts. It's just a little bit easier that way. One of the very last things I had to do before testing the DC to DC converters was to separate the two systems and isolate them. So I had been running the engine off of the lithium iron phosphate battery bank. I had been without an alternator for about 8 months, so all of the electrical requirements for the engine had to come from the main battery bank. And that was actually a drain on the battery bank, because when the engine is running, it does take around 7 amps of power to, all the time when it's running. So, that was a drain on our batteries last year as well, anytime we were motoring. So in order to separate the two systems, I had to remove that bridge, and I had to connect all of the engine electronics to the lead acid battery system. And so this switch up, there's a switch mechanism which is getting very cluttered up top, and it has all of the electronics for the engine. It has the starting wire, it has the wire from the alternator coming in, and I needed to run a wire from our new bus bars up to there to connect everything to the lead acid and disconnect the line that goes to the lithium iron phosphate battery bank. Now when I was doing this, I ran into a problem that it took me a little while to figure out. So when I switched over to the lead acid battery system, before I tested anything, before I put the fuses in the regulator for the alternator, which powers it up, I wanted to just make sure that I could start the diesel engine, the belt was tensioned right, everything would run, and I actually had a problem starting the diesel. So I was very nervous for a while. And I thought, okay, well, at first I'm like, okay, well, the lead acid battery is just dead because it's been in there for about 6 weeks. And I just bought it new from, the store. So I'm like, okay, well, the lead acid battery is probably dead. So I went and got a pair of jumper cables, and I actually jumped it, the starter, or I bridged the two systems again with a pair of jumper cables. So it was, the engine could use the lithium iron phosphate battery bank, and the engine still wouldn't start. So I'm like, what in the heck is going on? And I started looking at, I was sweating bullets. I'm like, oh geez, what did I do? So I loosened the belt on the alternator, got that off. I wondered if maybe somehow that was hindering it, or the alternator wasn't spinning and that was stopping the drive shaft. I didn't know. I was kind of freaking out. But so I took all that back off, and it still wouldn't start. And I'm like, okay, it's jumped directly from the lithium iron phosphate system, which is at 14.4 volts, so it should fire right up. And I started looking through, and I went back to the switch system here, and I started checking the voltage at the different posts on the back of the switch. And there was about a 0.5 volt difference between the two switch positions. I'm like, okay, that's not right. So I knew there was something going on there. So I actually I have 2 spare switches. So I switched everything over to a different switch, and I removed that one switch, and sure enough, it was broken. It was cracked. And I figured out what had happened. Those switches are kind of fragile, and that cable that I ran from the new bus bars for the DC to DC converters, I ran up there. I ran a 1/0 cable, the size, the wire diameter. And when I was closing that latch there, or that box that contains the switches, it actually broke the switch itself. So I could either switch it over to a different switch and just be very gingerly with it, and then maybe down the line, it would break again. I didn't want to deal with that. So I thought, you know what, instead of screwing around trying to bring all of the power from the new bus bars up to the switch, why don't I just bring all of the engine components back down to the bus bars where the power is? It just made more sense that way than to screw around with this switch. And if I ever need to disconnect the engine, I've never once turned the engine power off. I guess I did last summer, but I just turned the main house power off, the main battery bank. So I don't know why I would ever need to switch the power off for the engine, but I do have an extra switch. I can always put one in on the lead acid battery if I need it for some reason, but I don't know why I would. So I moved all of the all of the wires pretty much that you see up in this box. I pulled them back down, and they're now connected to the bus bars, and you'll see that up ahead here in a little bit. So that was a little bit of drama for about 3 hours while I was diagnosing it and going through everything. I thought perhaps I broke the engine, and I can't afford a new engine, so I was a little frantic for a while, but I got all the electronics pulled back down to those bus bars for the engine, and I tested it, and it fired right up. So I know it's not a problem. It was just that broken switch. So life is good, and at this point in time, I was ready to go ahead and test the DC to DC converters. And it was finally time to test the alternator and the DC to DC converters. And to do that, first I needed to make sure I could get enough cooling water to the engine so I could run it safely and briefly while the boat was out of the water. After feeling confident that I could keep the engine cool, I put the 2 fuses into the alternator regulator and restarted the engine. And when I fired up the engine, much to my chagrin, nothing happened. I was a little dejected, but I got out the schematics for the external regulator, and I started to go through the wiring there. I was testing, and I did some of this with the engine on, some with it off. I tried it a few times. And the 2 wires that come into the regulator, one of them it's just a reading for the battery voltage. The other one actually supplies power for the field. So the regulators, the way that I understand that it works, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the regulator is supposed to analyze the battery voltage, which it knows through one of those wires, and then apply a field to the alternator, and it's that field that initializes the alternator and tells it what output or what voltage output to do. So nothing was happening. There is a little potentiometer, a little screw on there that you can adjust, and that'll change the voltage output. So I monkeyed around with it a little bit. I did make a couple of adjustments to that screw, and at first I wasn't getting any field going out to the alternator. At first I thought it was an alternator issue, but I tested the voltage at the alternator, and the field wire was dead, so I knew that it wasn't an alternator problem. So then I went back and I tested the field, and it just wasn't putting one out. So then I made the adjustments, and I came back and tested it again. And on the right-hand side of the alternator regulator, there are 2 indicator lights. One's green, one's red, I believe. And the red one indicates an error. And I think with the adjustments that I was making, it just took a second for the changes to get through. And then as soon as that error cleared, you can hear the alternator initialize. And there you could definitely hear the tone shift in the engine when the alternator initialized and the workload on the engine went up. So yeah, that was when I heard that, it was wonderful. So then I opened up my app, my Victron app, and here it shows the overlay, shows all the Victron products that I had turned on at that time. The top 3 where it says Orion Smart, those are the DC to DC converters. Below that is the Smart BMV. That is my house bank battery monitor, and below that is the Smart Solar. That's the solar charge controller for the solar panels, and below that is VE Direct. That is my smaller inverter. It's only 500 watts. The 3000 watt inverter was not turned on, so it doesn't show up in that list. But you'll see here the DC to DC converters, I only had one turned on. I didn't want to go all out. I just wanted to test bringing them on board. And the first one is supposed to, the one that I had initialized, should have started to create power and charge the house battery bank when it hit 14 volts, and it did not. So there was something going on with the DC to DC converters that I needed to figure out. I did run upstairs quick just to check on the tach, and the tach is working. I haven't had a working tach in about 8 months, so that was wonderful. I do still have to test it to make sure it's accurate, but hey, at least it's working. The next thing to figure out is why weren't the DC to DC converters working? So I dug into the owner's manual, and you'll notice on the lower left-hand corner there's a little green plastic box there that has like a little wire loop on it. And that is called a remote wire bridge. And when you're putting your settings in, that is removed. And once you have all of your settings in, you have to put that piece in there. It doesn't come in there. It just comes on the side, and I didn't even know what it was for. But once you get all your settings in, you have to insert that little plug. It actually pulls in and out like a plug, and you have to put that in there. Otherwise, the DC to DC converters will not work. And after I inserted the remote wire bridges on all of the DC to DC converters, I fired everything back up. And here you can see as the voltage started to come up in the lead acid battery system, when it got up to 14 volts, which is the turn on point for the DC to DC converters, a couple of seconds after it hit 14 volts, the DC to DC converter kicked on and it started charging the lithium iron phosphate battery bank. As I switch over to the lithium iron phosphate battery monitor, here you'll see around 40 amps is actually going back into the battery bank. And right now I had solar coming in and also power from the DC to DC converter. And that 40 amps is not the total. The total is actually higher because I did have stuff in the boat on that was consuming energy. That's just 40 amps going directly into the battery bank. So I had stuff in the boat. I had a fridge and a freezer running. I had 4 fans going. I had the small inverter going. So I was consuming power above and beyond the 40 amps that was going back into the battery bank. And this was just at idle speed. The engine wasn't throttled up at all. It was just idling. So I was very happy, and I was really happy that stuff was working. And we're going to stick with this shot for a little bit. I know it's boring, but there was one final test that I had to do. Everything was working the way it was supposed to, but would it prevent the alternator from eating itself when the battery bank hit 100%? At this point in time, the battery bank was at around 95-96%, so I hung out for a while, and once it got up to about 99.2%, I turned the engine back on, and I just waited to see what would happen. And this shot is here because I was upstairs with my hand on the kill switch just in case something decided to start melting down, which is a very real possibility. So anyway, what I was looking for was, as that voltage crept up, once the voltage hit 14.4 volts, the DC to DC converters and the solar charge controller should both go into absorption mode, and the volts, or the total amps on the battery monitor, that's going into the battery bank, should slowly taper down. And if those things happened, then in theory the alternator should not start on fire this time. So let's see what happens. And I did speed this part up a little bit. You'll see the solar charge controller went into absorption right away when it hit 14.4 volts, which is great. And there was a slight delay on the DC to DC converter. And even though the battery monitor shows 100% on this overlay, it actually wasn't 100%. It was only about 99.7. The digital display inside the boat does show tenths, and this on this display only shows whole percent, so it rounds up. So when the DC to DC converter, when the battery bank did reach 100%, the DC to DC converter went into absorption mode, and it worked perfectly, and there was no fire. And after I shut down, I let it run for a few minutes just to make sure everything was okay. I tested the alternator. It was still putting out voltage, so I know we didn't fry it. And also, the DC to DC converter, there was a slight delay from that shutting down. So after I turned off the engine, it took probably another 4 minutes before the DC to DC converter actually turned off. And that's because the set points, the charge in the lead acid battery system was high enough. I forget exactly what it's set to, like 13.3 or something. So it'll actually keep converting until the voltage drops down below that threshold. So it ran for about 4 minutes beyond the engine, and then it turned off exactly like it was supposed to. So I'm going to chalk this one up as a win. I am going to test it a few more times over the upcoming days, just in brief I'm not going to run the engine for very long without a load on it. So I feel pretty good about this. I might bring 2 of these DC to DC converters online and just see what happens. You know, when the engine's idling, it's not going to be a real good test of their output, but just to see what happens. So, and I just did want to mention too, there is one thing that I'm going to do to change this system from what was shown. When I was talking to Battleborn about the settings for the DC to DC converters, he mentioned putting in circuit breakers. So he suggested a 40 amp circuit breaker for each of the DC to DC converters in the line, you know, the positive line between the bus bar and the converter, which I think is a great idea. I should have thought of that. So I do have 3 40 amp breakers on the way, and I will be installing those on those lines. Otherwise, you know, I'm going to leave it how it is, unless someone says you've got a real problem there, which if there's electricians out there, let me know if something's messed up. Anyway, I think we're going to put a pin in this one. I don't anticipate any problems with further testing, but if something pops up, I'll let you know. Dag nabbit, that was a long one. Thank God that's over. I would be shocked if anyone made it this far. You know what? If you actually are listening to this, if you have a dog, cat, rabbit, bird, fish, hamster, whatever, write its name in the comments down below and why you chose that name for it. It would just be interesting to see if anyone made it this far. I don't think anyone did. But I would love to give a massive shout out to my Patreon crew. Without your guys' support, I would not make these videos. And my Patreon crew is Joan and Juddy Judnick, Val and Chris Alcorn, Denise and Eli Sackett, Sherry Erickson, Deb Shaw, and Matthew Spadden. Thank you guys so very much. Your support means the world to me. And I do have one legacy patron member. Her name is Joan Linvo. Unfortunately, she has passed on, but she will live on in our hearts forever. We miss you, Joan. If you are interested in joining our Patreon crew, there is a link in the description down below, and that'll take you to our Patreon page where there are tons. I mean, at this point, there are hundreds of photos and videos. I do real-time updates. I try to do them a couple times a week at a minimum to let you know where we're at, what's actually going on, and that kind of stuff. And you'd also help support the channel, which would be awesome. If you do like our videos, please like, comment, and subscribe. That doesn't cost you anything, but it helps us out immensely. Anyway, I hope you all are well, and we'll see you next week.